Good afternoon, everyone who has joined bang on 2 o'clock to this webinar on the General Code. We're going to start in just 1 minute just to give everybody a chance to get signed on. Thank you. Okay, we will make a start. Good afternoon again, and welcome to the Spence and Partners webinar on the General Single Code, originally called the Single Code, but now the General Code, and we'll explain why there is the name change, but looking in particular at effective systems of governance, or ESOG, and own risk assessments. Together, ESOGs and ORA, so yet another two new acronyms for the pensions industry. I'm John Wilson. I'm Head of Technical Research and Policy at Spence, and I'm joined today by colleagues and fellow speakers, Caitlin Watson, Graham Cunningham, and Rachel Graham. And we are also joined by Becca Lavender in our marketing department to make sure everything runs smoothly. A little bit of housekeeping first. This webinar is being recorded. So a recording of it will be available afterwards. There will be plenty of opportunity for questions. So hopefully people can see the tab for submitting questions, and Becca will keep an eye on them and will let us know if and when a question or observation arises. The agenda today is really to give you a bit of background in terms of what has brought us here today for this webinar, then to look in detail at effective systems of governance, or ESoGs, and separately own risk assessments. But you might think about them as two sides of the same coin, and the effective system of governance is your management and oversight, and your own risk assessment is your evaluation of how your system of governance is actually doing. We'll look at what we think that trustees and other people involved in plan management and administration should be doing to get ready for ESOG, ORA, and the General Code. We'll introduce our way of evaluating where schemes are at in terms of their system of governance, what we call our governance framework, and show you some of the output that comes from that. And then we'll have a little look at the General Code, on which we have been waiting for nearly 3 years, as it was originally consulted on in March 2021, but only published in January this year, and is not actually even in force yet because it needs to lie before Parliament for 40 sitting days, and it's envisaged that the TPR, the Pensions Regulator, General Code will enter into force on the 27th of March 2024. Just before we get into this, just to get a feel for what work that people might have already done in this area, and discussions that trustees might have had with sponsors and suppliers and so on, we do have a couple of polls that will run now, and then we'll also revisit the end just to see if there's any kind of change in what people feel their status is in terms of the General Code. So, Becca, if I could ask you to run the first poll, please. Now, I'll maybe just double check with my fellow speakers. Are you able to see the poll?
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. I maybe have to. Okay. Yep, I needed to come off the slides there. Okay, I'll give people just a few more seconds to have a look at that. Okay, I mean, I think we've probably got most responses in now. It's good to see that the majority of people have some level of understanding of what's expected in this area, and the same proportion of people have actually made a start as well. And it's actually particularly pleasing to see 14% of respondents already having completed a full review. We'll revisit that towards the end. But Becca, I think there's a second question as well that we were going to ask at outset. If you could get you to launch that one now, please. Okay, so the second question at this point, how do you think your governance will measure up here? So what we're really looking here is kind of maybe looking back. So when you're starting to get to your own risk assessment, your evaluation of your system of governance, just, how much room for improvement do you think will there or will there not be? Okay, again, I mean, it's pleasing to see that, that progress has been made, and that, the majority of people expect that there will be some work to do when they get round to the own risk assessment. And we'll talk about when that will be as well. And that, I think, is the pensions regulator's expectation as well. The whole ESOG, or the General Code of Practice and the Management and Oversight, it is meant to be a system of continual improvement. And I actually think that even though the regulator will not initially be gleaning intelligence on the ORA, I suspect they will eventually. And when they do, my expectation is they're actually more likely to raise an eyebrow at somebody claiming 100% across all areas of system of governance, rather than somebody that says they've still got some tweaks and improvements to make. Okay, thank you for that. We'll go back to the slides now and get into the substantive ones. So we mentioned already that the General Code of Practice was only published on the 10th of January this year. And we're aware that many schemes, trustees and sponsors and administrators were awaiting the General Code before they started things like the gap analysis and looking at the system of governance and completing governance reviews. But I think it's worth reiterating that the law actually changed in January 2019. So a number of years ago, under statutory instrument 2018/1103, which implemented a second European Pension Fund Directive before the UK ceased to be a member state of the European Union. So the law did actually change a number of years ago, and the code was really just, if you like, the final piece of the jigsaw and filling in some of the blanks that were left from the primary and the secondary legislation. And what the law said was that trustees must establish and operate an effective system of governance, including internal controls. Before 2019, from around 2005, the requirement was for the trustees to establish internal controls. The addition was that trustees must establish and operate an effective system of governance, an ESoG, including internal controls. So if you like, the bar on management and oversight has been raised a little, but it's also been made much more scheme specific. So in addition to a higher bar, when deciding on your system of governance, you need to look at the status of your scheme in terms of its size, nature, scale, and activities. And your ESoG should be proportionate to the status of your scheme. And I think that's a point that's really worth enforcing. Because when we talk about proportionality, I think there was an expectation that maybe the code would explain exactly what every set of trustees should do in terms of their scheme for ESoG and ORA, and that was never going to be the case. When applying proportionality, it is for the trustees, as the stewards of the scheme, to decide what is proportionate to their scheme in terms of the size of the scheme. Is it above or below 100 members, for example? Its nature, is it DB, DC, or hybrid, and complexities of activities. So you can even take into account transactions like maybe doing a risk transfer exercise, or perhaps there is a plan to wind the scheme up. All of these issues are relevant to that concept of proportionality. And the regulator has itself stated that trustees need to use their own judgment on what is proportionate. But all schemes, or nearly all schemes, should be thinking about three key functions under this new regime. There is the risk management function, which many schemes may already have, but even if there is a function there that is responsible for looking at the risks that a scheme could face and what the implications would be should these risks arise, it's worth revisiting that risk management function in terms of its constitution and its composition to ensure that it meets the criteria for a risk management function as set out in the General Code of Practice. The internal evaluation function, which looks at the actual assessment of a scheme's system of governance, will return to that when we look at the own risk assessment, or ORA. And the actuarial function, which sounds quite a grand title, is nothing really new from a UK perspective. And for most schemes, or at least most schemes providing defined benefits, it will just be the scheme actuary. But perhaps one analogy that can be made, which will be familiar to many trustees, is when you think about how all this interacts and is joined up. If you think about the concept of integrated risk management that we use with defined benefit schemes, thinking about investment, funding, and covenant together. It's a bit like that when you're thinking about the General Code and ESOG and ORA, looking at your risk management, your internal evaluation, and the existing concepts of investment and funding, and so on. So back to what the legal requirements are again. As I say, the first part of this is the effective system of governance. And the slide here is a direct lift from the statutory instrument which came into force in January 2019. And according to the regulations, an effective system of governance should encompass sound and prudent management of activities, funding and investment, an adequate and transparent organizational structure with a clear allocation and appropriate segregation of responsibilities, composition and constitution of the governing board, which for many schemes will be the trustees, an effective system for ensuring transmission of information that covers disclosure regulations, wider communication with members, and reporting as well, reporting to the pensions regulator and to other bodies. An effective internal control system, which was effectively the part of the regime which has been around for a number of years now. Continuity and regularity in performance of activities. So that very important contingency plan, which became very real for many schemes during the COVID restriction period, where trustees had to work out if they could meet online and make effective decisions online, and they could execute documents electronically, etc. So a reminder of the importance of contingency planning. And now the ever topical environmental, social and governance factors, ESG, and climate change, and the regular internal review, which brings us back again to the own risk assessment. And to talk a little bit more about the ORA, I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Caitlin. So Caitlin, over to you.
Thanks, John. That's great. So now we know how we establish an effective system of governance. What's next? And well, schemes with more than 100 members are required under the General Code to produce an own risk assessment known as the ORA. The ORA should not be seen as a tick box exercise by trustees, as it should give them an opportunity to step back and consider how the board operates and how they comply with regulations. The pensions regulator expects the ORA to include information on how trustees integrate their gap analysis findings in order to improve their scheme governance. So like John mentioned earlier, they aren't expecting everyone to come out 100% pass rate. They're expecting there to be things flagged and noted and things put in place on how they plan to make improvements going forward, so that when they submit their next ORA after that, they can show improvements that have been made. They also expect them to assess the effectiveness of the risk management system, how the trustees have prevented conflicts of interest with the employer where key functions have been outsourced. I'll come back to that again on my next slide. How the trustees assess the scheme funding needs with reference to a recovery plan where applicable. Detail how the trustees assess the risk to members and beneficiaries relating to paying out of their benefits. The mechanisms which protect retirement benefits, such as guarantees or financial support from the principal employer, assessment of operational risks. And again, as John mentioned, the last requirement is for trustees to report on how ESG factors are considered when making investment decisions. They are also required to report on how they would assess new or emerging ESG risks. And we've added an asterisk to this one here just to kind of raise that in the draft general code, this was an option for trustees to include this, but since we've seen the final code, that's actually been made a requirement. And finally, once the ORA has been completed, it's required to be signed by the chair of trustees and made available. So if we can move on to the next slide, John. Thank you very much. With regards to reporting on the prevention of conflicts of interest, Spence reached out to the DWP to query if certain people, such as pensions managers who are employed by the principal employer, would be prevented from carrying out an ORA for the scheme, and would it be seen as a conflict by the DWP? So the DWP came back to confirm that they don't intend to exclude any job holders from completing the risk assessment if they're employed by the principal employer. They reiterated that the trustees have the overall responsibility on who they delegate to complete their own risk assessment, and that they should be able to take account of the conflicts of interest. And the trustees therefore ultimately can decide who complete the assessment as long as they've considered this correctly. So they're not planning to put any policy or changes in place regarding this. And if there is no further comments from any of my colleagues, I will pass you on to my colleague Graham.
Thanks very much, Caitlin. So probably at this stage, you've heard a lot of words, and you've been led to believe there's quite a lot in this, and that is probably perfectly true. So as trustees, you're perhaps wondering what the next steps should be going forward. So within these next few slides, hopefully I'll enlighten you in that respect. I think probably one of the first things that a trustee should seek to do is establish a risk management team. So effectively a risk management subcommittee with a specific terms of reference for handling what they need to do under ESoG and ORA. And then it would be helpful to understand the journey plan for your scheme, where it currently sits, the current position of the scheme. So for example, what I mean by that is it a scheme that's heading very shortly towards a buy-in transaction? Is that something that's more of a longer term, medium term target? Is it a scheme that's perhaps teetering on the brink of entering a PPF assessment period, for example? Or is it a scheme that looks like it's going to run on for quite a substantial amount of time? So understanding the context of your scheme and where it currently sits will help inform how you approach what you do under ESoG and ORA as well. So a risk management subcommittee would seek to draft the trustee policies for the three key functions that John mentioned earlier. And then, of course, an outsourcing policy as well for any suppliers that you bring on board to help you with the aspects of the scheme. The risk management subcommittee should seek then to draft a scheme-specific governance framework, which I'll then demonstrate in the following slides. But effectively, the governance framework sets to outline everything about the organisational structure, the allocation of tasks, the policies and procedures. It looks at every aspect of the operations and management of the scheme, line by line, and assesses you against where you think you're currently sitting, what needs action, or what needs improved, and what's completely missing. So basically, it's a scheme-specific review of your governance documents. It would set you quite far along the path to doing an own risk assessment, and effectively you're doing that work as at the same time. Within each line of the governance framework, you're assessing the approach of proportionality to each aspect of the scheme's governance. Then, further to that, you're able to draft perhaps an order of priority of which tasks or policies and procedures need to be improved or beefed up, if you like, in the first instance. And then you would seek to incorporate this order of priority within your business plan. Now, business plan is something you're probably familiar with, and that it's reported regularly to trustee meetings. In between trustee meetings, it can be looked at. So it's a living and breathing document, in other words. So further to the work in the governance framework, once you've established what action you need to take from there, you would look to seek that and incorporate that into your business plan with specific timelines and dates as to when you would seek to do and take action as required. Okay, to move on to the next slide, please, John. Sorry, speaking on autopilot there. Further to that, another aspect of this is trying to identify how you can test the effectiveness of your system of governance. So various levels of stress testing, simulating a cybersecurity breach, for example, to try and test the robustness, I guess, of your information security protocols. What do you do in a scenario, for example, when a trustee chair is unable to attend a meeting at very short notice? Do you have a contingency plan in place? Is there a deputy chair? Is there someone who can chair the meeting on their behalf? Do you have a laid out and documented? So a lot of what the governance framework seeks to do is effectively document everything in terms of your contingency plans, your procedures, and your policies. And it's not intended then to lay in a shelf and gather dust. It's, as John and Caitlin mentioned, is a continuously monitoring process for continuous improvement as well. The framework also seeks to incorporate a review timetable. So within each line, you would be looking to see how often do you need to revisit these policies to keep them up to date and relevant. That could be at least every 3 years, or maybe it needs to be more frequent than that, depending on the nature of the procedure and what it relates to. And once you've done all that, then you would present that to the trustee board to effectively approve it, agree it, and record that approval somewhere if the pensions regulator does come calling and wants you to demonstrate the effectiveness of your system of governance. You have it all documented and ready to share as required. So within the next slide, if I recall correctly, there should be a visual demonstration of the governance framework itself. So this particular example focuses on a very narrow element of governance, which is GDPR, a term I'm sure we're all fairly familiar with. As I mentioned before, I think the governance framework itself could be in excess of 200 lines. So a small aspect of this, if we focus in on GDPR for a second, as you can see on the slide, we go through each individual aspect of GDPR as it applies to the scheme. For example, that will be your information security policy, what you do when you receive a subject access request, how do you document data breaches, what's your data breach response team. So each of those various items are shown on the left-hand side. Then you would want to allocate ownership of those particular aspects of the governance. Is it with the trustee? Is it with a data breach subcommittee? Is it with the scheme secretary? So who has a responsibility for overseeing that particular aspect of the governance? And in the third column, as you can see clearly, the intention would be that this framework would quite simply show a RAG rating or a red, amber, green rating. So clearly, if it's highlighted as being red as you go through it and analyze what you've got in place, if it's red, then it's either wholly inadequate or it's not there at all. If it's amber, then you probably do have something in place already, but you probably need to revisit it, update it, or improve it quite substantially. And of course, if it's showing green, then you can be quite clear that it's effective in terms of the effective system of governance. You can add various comments within the governance framework as well to provide more detail about why you've given that particular rating. So you're doing nothing more than going through line by line every aspect of your operation and management of the scheme. So it's going through it with a fine tooth comb and assessing comments to that, applying a rating to it, and then seeking to develop an improvement plan where necessary and incorporate that into your business plan. And on the next slide, hopefully this will demonstrate something that's a bit more readable, perhaps a bit more user-friendly in terms of the output of this governance framework. What you see here is an example of something that could be presented to as part of a meeting pack to the trustee to show at a glance where the scheme currently sits in terms of being able to demonstrate an effective system of governance. So that's the output. You have the input, the process, and the output effectively. So probably just the key takeaways from this particular section is that when working on a governance framework, it's not intended to be merely a gap analysis or a checkbox exercise. It's a bit more to it than that. It's looking at every single aspect of your scheme and trying to flesh out what you have in place at the moment. Is it adequate? Is it effective? And where you need to improve. And from that, of course, you can identify the gaps. That then feeds into a gap analysis, which then, of course, in itself, both of these feed into your own risk assessment. So going through that whole process, you'd be a long way to being able to demonstrate an effective system of governance. And I think I'm handing over to Rachel, who will give a bit more detail on how you can fill any gaps that are identified in such a scenario.
Thank you, Graham. Yeah, so once you have the governance framework done and you've had the report back, which identifies where there are areas for improvement, the next step then is to look at how trustees can improve the scheme's governance framework overall. Our colleagues in-house have developed a suite of template policies, procedures and processes which cover the governing body, administration, communication, funding and investments. And we can use those in-house template policies, procedures and processes to help our clients demonstrate good governance and comply with the new requirements. As Graham said, we need to avoid looking at the requirements of the General Code as a checklist, if you like, of documents that just we need to tick off and have on file. Instead, our aim is actually to help our clients make good governance a key part of their culture. Just on to the next slide then, John. So after quite a long 3-year wait, we now have the final version of the General Code, which John had taken us through earlier. And this is the final piece of the jigsaw really that we have been waiting for. So the code explains to trustees and to scheme managers of private and public sector pension schemes the standards of conduct and practice expected of them when carrying out functions under pensions legislation, and it will assist them to comply with legal requirements. The code isn't entirely prescriptive. As my colleagues have said, an element of judgment will need to be exercised when considering what is reasonable for ensuring compliance for each individual pension scheme. On the next slide then, what we've done is we've just set out really some key differences. So we had the draft code, we had a version of that sitting with us for a while, and then finally in January we had the final version, the General Code. So some things changed between the draft and between the final version of the code that we've seen released last month. And I'll not go through each and everything that's changed, but just picking out a few key points. In terms of the own risk assessment, so the regulator have actually said they don't have any plans to produce guidance on how trustees should complete an own risk assessment, but they have helpfully set out 2.5 pages of what they call expectations when it comes to the own risk assessment. With regards to stewardship, the regulator have said governing bodies should consider following the principles set out in the Financial Reporting Council's Stewardship Code. So that code defines stewardship as the responsible allocation, management and oversight of capital to create long-term value for clients and beneficiaries, leading to sustainable benefits for the economy, the environment and society. So those are just a few key differences between the draft code, which you may have seen and had presented to you at some of your trustee meetings over the last couple of years, and then in terms of then the differences between the final general code. Just on to the next slide then. So you might actually remember, especially if you've had some presentations on this early on in the process from your advisors, the new code was actually once referred to as the single code of practice, but it's now formally known as the general code, and that's because the general code consolidates 10 of the pension regulators' codes of practice and not all of them, as I think originally might have been the intention. So there's now a code 16 as well, which I think is just missing from the slide. That's for collective DC schemes. So the general code that we now have, that covers 10 of the regulators' policies, and you'll see we've put a tick here beside the codes of practice that are covered by the code. And as far as we are aware, there's not any immediate plans to consolidate all of the regulators' codes of practice just yet. John, I think I'm handing back to you then for final comments.
You are indeed. Yeah, thank you, Rachel, Graham and Caitlin. So I just wanted to kind of wrap up before we move on to revisiting the poll and any questions. Just, what might you do following this webinar? And I think the starting point is for somebody to say, I'll take responsibility for this. So you will need to put in place that risk management function. Certainly, if you've got a scheme with more than 100 members, that risk management function needs to get up to speed with new requirements. Then they need to undertake that governance review, which I'll come on to. And then you need to get ready for the ORA, or the own risk assessment. Now, in terms of the approach, there's more than one way of going about this. I mean, I've said already, responsibility for proportionality rests with the trustees, and the regulator's general code of practice is not prescriptive on how you undertake an effective system of governance. And one description that I've actually seen is it depends which end of the telescope you're looking into. Now, I'm not quite sure that the regulator would like that analogy, but I understand what that commentator was saying. If you were to go through every aspect of the operation of your pension scheme, and that's what ESOG is. ESOG is anything that affects the operation of your pension scheme. Then our governance framework in terms of the operational narrative is over 200 lines long. So you're doing a very comprehensive review if you do go through that, and it's maybe something to consider over time. But another way to look at this is that a lot of people, when talking about ESOG, say it's about your policies, processes, procedures, templates and other documents, and making sure that they are complete and up to date. And when I thought about all the policies and so on that were referenced in the code, I got to about 40 or 45, and not all of these will be applicable to all schemes. It will depend on your scheme's DB, DC. It will depend on whether or not your scheme has more than 100 members. So that size, nature, activities and circumstances. And some of these policies you might already have. For example, if you've got more than 100 members, you would expect to have a statement of investment principles. If you're a defined benefit scheme, you would expect to have a statement of funding principles. But even when you think, oh, I've already got them, they are going to have to be revisited, even if it's briefly, just to make sure that they are code compliant. And I think, moreover, in terms of deciding what the correct approach is for your scheme when approaching the General Code, ESOG and ORA, it's important to remember it's not just about having these policies, sort of knowing where they are. It's about understanding the content of them and adopting them. And what I think is absolutely fundamental here in terms of an overarching aspect of this is that the effective system of governance is about a culture and not a checklist. So it's not just ticking off that all the policies are there. And do remember that probably within a couple of years' time, you are going to need to do an own risk assessment, which is the evaluation of the system of governance. Now, again, there is some flexibility around that. This is not a formal accreditation of your scheme. It does not need it to be audited by somebody with the relevant qualifications. It can be undertaken by an evaluation committee set up by the trustees, but they are going to have to go through the system of governance and identify areas that might be improved over time. And they're going to have to do this, in line with the timescale with the regulations. Originally, the regulator had hinted that they wanted an own risk assessment done within about a year. They've dropped that when they moved from the single code to the general code to revert to the legislative requirements, and they just restate the legislative requirements in the general code. So your first own risk assessment must be within 12 months after the end of the first scheme year that begins after the code comes into force. So it will depend on when your scheme year end is for the purposes of your scheme financial statements. But if later, the ORA can be done within 15 months, beginning with the date on which the trustees are next required to obtain an actuarial valuation. So that is the triennial valuation under the defined benefit funding regime. Or, from a DC point of view, by the date on which the trustees are next required to prepare a chair's annual governance statement, the familiar DC chair statement. It's the later of these three timescales that I've just referred to. But once you've done your first one, it becomes, I suppose, in a sense, a little bit easier in that your subsequent own risk assessment should be carried out on a 3-yearly basis. It is up to the governing body, the trustees, to decide who should do that. But given one of the requirements is around the prevention of conflicts of interest, maybe adding somebody to the governing body who meets independence criteria and who has the relevant skill set might be a way to improve the efficiency of the own risk assessment. So that's my views on possible next steps. We do have plenty of time for questions. But Becca, I think before we move on to questions, we were going to effectively rerun one of the polls and just see whether this presentation has changed views. So if you could launch that now, please. Okay, I think we've got responses in, and what we have here is a complete consensus around largely complying with some tweaks but with some tweaks and improvements needed. And I think, that is a good place to be. It's where the regulator expects many pension schemes to be, but for some schemes, maybe at the smaller end in particular, if that is where your pension scheme is at in the view of the governing body, then I would probably contend that you are slightly ahead of the curve. Okay, I mentioned that we do have time for questions. Let me see if I can access the chat box directly. I can't. Becca, can you see any questions?
There's nothing at the moment, John. No questions being posed.
Okay. I will give it just another minute. Maybe I can just clarify 1 or 2 points from the presentation as well. So we have talked about ESOG and ORA as 2 sides of the same coin, but it's worth pointing out in terms of the technical requirements that ESOG is applicable to all pension schemes. The own risk assessment is applicable legally to schemes with only more than 100 members. That said, the regulator does imply that even for schemes not subject to a strict own risk assessment requirement, there is probably merit in doing that internal evaluation of the system of governance to ensure that the scheme is being run as well as it could be, or if it's not, and perhaps the scheme would benefit from better efficiencies of scale, whether there is a debate to be had amongst the governing body as to possible consolidation. Okay, assuming that no last minute questions have come in, we will wrap up then and give you a little bit more time back in your day. But if anything comes to you after the presentation, then please don't hesitate to get in touch with either your regular contact at Spencer Partners or anyone who has been presenting today. I hope you found that useful. Thank you to my co-speakers and to Becca for moderating the presentation. And we hope to speak to you again soon. Thank you and have a good afternoon.